Dr. Kalla, I wanted to ask you another question, and that's the tie-in of some of these conditions you mentioned, ADD, ADHD, some of the issues that we feel are correlated to or contributed to by electropollution, and to some extent at least, and pharmaceutical drugs and what's being prescribed, especially to kids and teenagers in schools today. Can you shed a little bit of light as what your theory is of the correlation between the two, and how electropollution really plays a major role, or may play a major role in how these conditions are treated and how people go about it?
Sure, Alfred, and you again, hit the nail on the head. One of the difficulties is that, for the past 5 to 7 years, and of course that is the time frame when we have the most dramatic increase in wireless technology use and background exposure to information-carrying radio waves. And I've mentioned this to folks before, that it took 20 years for the first billion cell phone users. So by the end of 2004, we had our first billion. 18 months later, we had the second billion, and 12 months later, we had the third billion. So, we are looking at an exponential curve in terms of the increase of exposure to these information-carrying radio waves, most of this in the last 4 or 5 years. When you read the educational literature, the pediatric literature, the medical studies that are published in those journals, folks are talking about an increase in conditions like ADHD, hyperactive disorders, learning problems. And what's happening is that the conventional medical community, they treat these kids with antidepressants and Ritalin and those types of pharmaceutical interventions. And most of the time they tag these kids as having some type of inherited behavioral disorder. And they put the blame on the parents, and they put the blame on the kids. And we look at this much differently, because we know that when intercellular communication is disrupted, the pathology that ensues is the baseline or the basic pathology for attention deficit hyperactive disorder, for learning problems, difficulty focusing, and that these conditions should not be treated with pharmaceuticals. These kids should not be on drugs. The parents should not be blamed for the circumstance. And we find that this is one of those areas where, when we are able to talk about the cause, the information-carrying radio waves being the cause, parents first they breathe a sigh of relief and say, "My God, I'm glad it's not me. I'm glad it wasn't me, and I'm also glad it's not my son or it's not my daughter." So as folks are out there talking to people in schools and talking to parent-teacher groups and to other school society groups, teachers groups, don't be afraid at all to point out that we are over-medicating our children, and that the information-carrying radio waves are indeed related to these types of conditions, and that we can prevent them. These conditions are preventable. It means they're unnecessary. We don't need to have our children suffer. We don't need to have our teachers suffer. There is a way to fix this without medication, and as I say, without blaming the parents and without blaming the children.
Dr. Kalla, looking into the future, what do you see as it relates to electrosensitivity? If the current tendency of entire cities, entire counties, entire regions, even entire countries going wireless, and so in other words, even individuals that choose not to use, let's say, a cell phone or cordless phone, or choose not to have a wireless router in the home, inadvertently we are exposed, whether we like it or not. What do you see happening with hypersensitivity levels? Right now the World Health Organization estimates that only 3 or 4% of the world's population has a condition called electrohypersensitivity, but the reason that makes me question that statistic, and I think it's way underestimated, is the fact that many people don't even realize what they are feeling is related to electropollution to a great extent. So what does the future hold from an epidemiology perspective for EHS or electrohypersensitivity when the tendency is to blanket the globe with wireless access?
Well, the term electrohypersensitivity in and of itself underestimates the condition. The condition that you're speaking of probably occurs 3 to 4 times a higher incidence than 2 to 3%. It's probably more like 10 to 12%. That condition, the electrohypersensitivity, is one of a number of conditions that are under a syndrome that we call membrane sensitivity syndrome. And membrane sensitivity syndrome is the cell membrane pathology that occurs after someone has chronic exposure to these information-carrying radio waves. And it is a very debilitating condition. This is not something that is trivial. People who have membrane sensitivity syndrome, the electrohypersensitivity variety of membrane sensitivity syndrome, they are debilitated. If they're in a room where there's Wi-Fi, or if they're in a room where somebody turns on a cell phone, they have to leave. They have an autoimmune response. They become nauseous. Some of them pass out. When they go home, they have very, very severe stomach problems. Many of them bleed. They end up having blood in their stool. They're not able to work. Their spouses wear out. Many of them, their marriages break up. They have difficulty with their relationships with their children. It is an extremely debilitating condition that is afflicting, we believe, almost in the double-digit % of the population. The other thing that happens here is that in the 1980s and 90s, there was a new condition called multiple chemical sensitivities. And multiple chemical sensitivities is membrane sensitivity syndrome that is induced by chemicals. So you have a whole group of people out there who suffer from multiple chemical sensitivities, and what we are finding is that everyone who has multiple chemical sensitivities also has electrohypersensitivity. So that what's happened here is that the information-carrying radio waves trigger the adverse immune responses in these people who are already afflicted with the exposure from the chemicals. So we are very, very concerned. You know, as you may remember, we run a registry in the Safe Wireless Initiative where we gather data with people who have these types of symptoms, and we study that. We are opening up registries now in Canada and England and Ireland and other places around the world because no one else is counting. That is the tragedy here. We in the Safe Wireless Initiative have the only registry in the world that is tracking what happens to people who are exposed to these information-carrying radio waves, and our assessment, our fear here is that this has moved from a health risk issue to a medical problem for so many people. And that is another reason why we think it's so important that we are able to intervene with these young children in schools, with the school boards and the parents in these schools, because that is going to be the best place to make progress, because there is no regulatory authority who will interfere. When we look at cell phones, the FDA and the FCC, they interfere with our ability to protect people. And when we look at base stations and towers, the FCC and the other regulatory authorities interfere because they're being pressured by the industry. With Wi-Fi in schools, there is no opportunity for interference because there is no regulatory authority who has taken jurisdiction. So this is the biggest opportunity for us to do some good.